afternoon. Welcome to India's World. I'm Tracy Shilji. Now today we're focusing on the Indian diaspora, which according to the World Migration Report 2018 is the largest in the world. Published by the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations Migration Agency, the report says that over 15 million migrants from India are living abroad. And because the country has the largest number of migrants abroad, India also receives the highest amount of remittances at nearly $69 billion. During his trips abroad, Prime Minister Modi has focused heavily on the Indian diaspora and enjoys huge popularity among them. So how significant are these numbers then, and how is it that the government is going to use it for India's advantage? Joining us on the discussion today, we have Mr. Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, joining us in studio here. We have Sriram Cholia, Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs, Mr. T.K. Arun, Editor of Opinion at Economic Times, and also joining us on Skype from the US is Nish Acharya, former Senior Advisor in the Obama administration and currently CEO of Equal Innovation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here in India's World. Mr. Sibal, if I could start with you first. NRI is close to 1% of India's population. If you could briefly explain, especially for our viewers, why is it so important, the Indian diaspora, especially to foreign policy?
Well, Indian diaspora has long historical roots. It's not something that has occurred in recent years. After all, if you take Guyana, or you take Fiji, or you take the Caribbean islands, India and some of these countries, the population of Indian origin is in the majority. Then you have South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania and other places where historically, Mauritius, where Indians went as indentured labor and have stayed back and have grown in numbers. The important, the migration which is what we are talking about, or we should talk about, is one that has occurred after our independence.
Yes.
Where Indians have gone out for studies, for education, for improving their economic prospects in life. A lot of engineers, doctors and others have gone, specialists in various fields. And then, of course, there is this migrant labor, especially in the Gulf,
yes,
where the numbers have grown. I saw the Saudi ambassador's interview the other day, and he said there are now 3.5 million Indians
absolutely.
in
it's the highest
Saudi Arabia, with an increase of 30% in the last year or so. And in Britain, of course, there is a very large. The most critical diaspora that we have abroad is in the United States, where it has now climbed to beyond 3 million. Because amongst the people from outside, this is a community which is the best educated and has the highest median income. And therefore, they can be and are a very useful asset for building up India-US relationship, and in many other areas, whether it's finance or economics or science and technology, education or whatever else, they can be very useful. Similarly, we have, didn't mention in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of people of Indian origin.
Yes, that's
there
right.
too. So actually these are building blocks for our international stature, if we can get it right, and we are getting it right, because they can contribute a lot to the image of India, build bridges between India and these countries, especially in the sectors in which they are present, and they're playing a useful role in their host countries. And this can help in so many ways. In terms of economic prospects. Yes, so many ways. I think this is an asset we have, and I'll end by saying that in this age of globalization, it's a hackneyed phrase, this is part of your globalized network.
Yes.
And unlike in the past, this can now be a very helpful tool in your building up of your modern India.
All right. And taking that forward, since you do mention about how crucial the Indian diaspora is in the US, Nish Acharya, of course, there, like I mentioned, a former advisor to the Obama administration. Nish, it's people like you really that India looks up to, to take our name forward. But at the same time, how do you think, the Indian diaspora acts? Does it actually help, in what we call soft power as far as diplomacy is concerned?
So I think the Indian diaspora is useful as a supplemental tool for India. So what I mean by that is that the diaspora cannot lead the charge on India's behalf. Diaspora communities by definition are have a little bit of a distant relationship with their home country. They've left for a reason. Usually in the case of India, it was economic, and they have dual responsibilities to their home country and to the nation they've adopted. And so I think the biggest role the Indian diaspora has played in the bilateral relationship with the United States is simply building a sense of trust and a sense of relationship. And so for a long time, America's had a good relationship with Europe, which is historical, but it's also was based on the fact that the majority of white Americans were of European descent. Well, now if you look around the United States, people are used to having an Indian American physician. They're used to having their children have Indian American friends. They're used to, if they're in the technology sector, certainly they're used to having an Indian American who's their boss, who's the founder and owner of the company. And I think that leads to a changed perception of Indian Americans as being part of their community, being part of their life. And therefore, it's an easy transition to then say that India, therefore, should be a part of the United States and be a part of the United States global alliances and a friend of the United States, and that we can build off that. So the diaspora itself isn't going to lead any diplomatic efforts. It's not going to lead the creation of a bilateral investment treaty or anything of that nature. But I think it's done enormous work to build a sense of camaraderie and friendship between the two nations that now we're seeing manifest itself in the political realm as well.
Absolutely, and whenever we do see even Prime Minister Modi, he does make it a point to reach out to the diaspora and also use it, of course, in such a way to also tell the country there that, we are such a significant portion, of course, of your population there. But, talking about this, as far as the diaspora is concerned, do we have a coherent, some strong diaspora strategy? Does India have that?
I don't think there is a formal spelled out strategy, but implicit in the way Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, has been reaching out to them, there is, of course, a strategy that unfolds. So, see, part of the strategy is also to address the domestic audience.
Yes.
When he addresses the Americans in New York, it is telecast live back to India, and it has a telling effect on the audience back home. So that's a principal aim. But apart from that, see, they are a significant source of influence in the US today, as he said. Perhaps not in every other country, but in the US they certainly are. And it helps shape American thinking on India and the world. Now, India got the Indo-US nuclear deal. In, say, very black and white thinking on the part of President Bush. Now, in shaping that kind of thing, Indians are good guys, Chinese are bad. The conduct of Indian Americans there, I'm sure, would have certainly played a role.
Yes.
We are there in Silicon Valley as loyal, capable, intelligent workers, as entrepreneurs who start companies, who generate employment, and who are clearly part of the intellectual leadership of that particular segment. So these people must be good, and I mean, they have been well behaved. Indian Americans are one of the best behaved communities in the US in terms of crime or in terms of education, of families staying together and all that. So overall, that perception colors that countries and governments' view of the country back home. So that is good. They are ambassadors of the country, not appointed by the
unofficial ambassadors of the country in a certain sense.
Ambassadors. And this extends to culture as well.
Yes.
So, to the Western ear, our music sounds very strange, but then gradually they'll learn to appreciate certain qualities. And moving to a global appreciation of the diversity of human culture is actually the eventual goal of, if not a conscious goal, the eventual consequences of globalization. And the Indian diaspora is playing a role in that. And see, they used to be eager to integrate, be part of the melting pot and join the mainstream. Increasingly, they are able to retain their identity and add to the multicultural part, richness of those societies.
Yes.
And this will actually what will create, after a very long journey, perhaps which will be tough, and there will be rough patches, a collective global human community. So, apart from that, in science and technology, as Mr. Sibal said, how universities can gain from Indian diasporic members who have achieved academic excellence, coming and working in India, teaching in Indian universities, setting purely serving as role models. the fact that Amartya Sen is a global prize winning economist
Absolutely.
helps a lot of people in India work deeper in economics. Similarly, Ramakrishnan, I mean, so many people who are of Indian origin and who have been Indians. So all this helps stimulate our own economy, our own intellectual capabilities, our strategic thinking, and so many things. So all this is to the good.
Absolutely. And does it actually also, is it also one of the wheels of India's development? Can we say that to a certain extent?
Ideally, it should be, Tracy. In the past, the inward investments coming from our overseas citizens, as they are called now, OCI, Overseas Citizens of India, has not been great. And that is linked to, of course, India's own, bureaucratic hurdles to investment, generally speaking.
Yes.
I think Prime Minister Modi has put on the best possible show to attract NRI and OCI investments back home. But I think the best results of that are still up in the future. What we have achieved so far, I think, is first, he has been able to, establish that emotional connect between what I call the civilizational India, which is spread out, these 30 million people of Indian origin across the world, and the territorial construct of India. These two, there was a divide, and he has bridged it far better than any previous politician who has led this country. And secondly, what we have been able to do, as has been mentioned by co-panelists, is some of these well-organized overseas citizens of India have banded together and have been effectively used for political lobbying.
Yes.
Now, for example, if there's a bill relating to US military aid to Pakistan, our lobbies are very, very effective in the caucuses, the congressional, moving the whole system.
Yes.
Likewise, in the Middle East, if there are policies that could be detrimental to Indian interests, they are banding together now. And I will also credit overseas friends of BJP, because that is in many ways interlinked with this overseas, the diaspora outreach that we have done in the last 3 years, because they have been able to in many ways break some of these cliques and factions that used to divide our NRIs and OCIs.
Okay.
They used to be along linguistic lines, along regional lines, sometimes pure games of one-upmanship as to who will be the president of this association or that one, and all of these, to some extent, we've been able to create a harmonious concept of the overseas citizens of India, or as, in fact, Prime Minister often refers to them as Mere Pyare Deshwasiyo.
Yes.
So in that way, he has broken the barrier that because you left India doesn't mean that we have forsaken you or you should forsake us. So I think that's the biggest change that has come about. But also a lot of policy. I just want to mention a couple of them. First, we used to have an overseas Ministry for Overseas Indian Affairs.
Okay.
That's been now merged back into the Ministry of External Affairs under Modi. I think that was a very critical reform, because the overseas Indian affairs had almost become like a sinecure for some politicians from Kerala, and they were using it for patronage networks. And it was not leading to overall enhancement of the Indian diplomatic goals. Right? To bring it back into MEA, I think was important, to show that diaspora is part of our overall foreign policy. It's not a separate thing.
Yes.
Then secondly, we have done some reform. For example, the investments of NRIs and OCIs will no longer be considered as foreign investment, but will be given equal status as domestic investment. So that reduces some caps and increases the economic incentives for them to come back here. So likewise, there are many things we've done more, I think, now for crises and for helping our overseas citizens who are trapped in extreme situations. Rescue acts, we have done far better. Humanitarian diplomacy. So all these, if you link up, and then of course the Prime Minister's overall ability to arouse the Mother India feeling across these 30 million people, I think is remarkable. So in that sense, today we are much stronger than we used to be with the diaspora diplomacy ever before. Of course, the first reform started with, in many ways, with Atal Bihari Vajpayee's time, 1998 to 2004. But Modi has really given, with Pravasi Bharati,
given the push that was required.
Just the scale and the charisma, plus the innovative new policies and approaches. I think the diaspora is able to feel that finally, they can look up to India with pride and also give back to India.
Absolutely.
But the
and as far as
cashing in of that still remains in the future.
And let's take this giving back to India, aspect. Tunisia, there is always, at least in India here, there's a assumption that perhaps we should be getting more from the Indian diaspora, which is seen to be doing much better, economically, especially. The connect that we of course have as far as the Indian diaspora and us is concerned is definitely emotional. But in what other ways can we expect the Indian diaspora to contribute whether it's in even the rural sectors for that matter, that is another place where perhaps they can contribute.
Right. So I think it goes back to what I had said earlier, which is that the diaspora's contribution will be supplemental. It will not be the primary driver of anything. And I think there's a couple ways to think about it. I would actually disagree with the last speaker on a couple of points. I think Prime Minister Modi has, he's visited the United States for 30 years now. And so it's amazing how many NRIs actually have met him. And the speaker was absolutely right that the personal connection that's been developed has been enormous. But at the same time, I think I would say I've been a little bit disappointed in the Modi government's actual efforts to engage the diaspora. And I think there's two areas I would comment on. One is investment might have been easier from the Indian side because of the change that he mentioned around OCI investments being treated as domestic. But from the U.S. side, the European side, it's not easier because there still lacks proper investment treaties. You still have to jump through hoops and go through Mauritius or Dubai or Singapore. You still have to, every transaction still has to be approved by SEBI for a debt transaction. So those hurdles still haven't been improved and transformed. And on the philanthropic side, there's some real concerns which came about with the government's a little bit stricter policies they've taken about foreign funds coming into Indian NGOs. And I'm not commenting on whether that was appropriate or not. There were certainly cases where there was some abuse and need to crack down. But there is a general sense that foreign funds are not as welcome. And the reality is that you can't separate an American foundation from an Indian American foundation. It's the same American capital. And so
Yes.
While the Modi administration may have had its reasons for doing that, the result is that the capital from foreign funders for philanthropy particularly gets impacted in the same way. So I think it's nice some of the things they've done around the Ministry of for NRIs, and it's nice that they've made some of the remittance rules easier. But I think if they really want to see investment, particularly in social enterprise, particularly for philanthropy, there's really two things they need to do. One is to address this growing perception, even amongst diehard Modi supporters, that their funds are not wanted on the philanthropic side like they used to be. And then secondly, I think to replicate what the Chinese did, which is to really educate Indian Americans and Indians in the Gulf and Indians in Southeast Asia worldwide about what's going on in the development sector. I think people, diasporas by nature, when they leave India, they have a certain set of preconceptions about the country, and time stands stills for the diaspora. So
absolutely. Also, there's a sense of disconnect, so you would like to get that.
There's a disconnect,
yes,
right.
Yes.
So you really need to know that this NGO is doing this kind of work, or this Swachh Bharat scheme has built this many toilets. I mean, I think that information is so critical, and only the government can provide that.
That's an information critical for even people like us here in India. I mean, we would want that transparency everywhere. Yes.
I think this is a bit of a bugbear. We are talking about diaspora, and I don't know how NGOs and American philanthropic foundations come into this. I mean, they are not part of the diaspora. And if some American NGOs are, and generally they tend to be Christian, and there are concerns about the religious activity and conversions and this and that. That has nothing to do with the Indian foundations, if there are, who want to send money to India. So I think that it has become an issue. It has been made into an issue because some key personalities in the Trump administration, like Pence and others, they are die-hard Christian fundamentalists, and therefore they look very critically at what is happening in India.
Nish just wants to make a yes, Nish.
That's unfortunately that's factually incorrect. The way the U.S. rules are set up, I have a foundation, and I have to use the same process as a Christian foundation or a Jewish foundation to send money to India and get the same approvals from Indians. So it affects every NRI who is doing anything in India the same way that it affects anybody else. And secondly, most American NGOs are not Christian groups. They're non-denominational secular groups. And again, as I said, the Indian government may have its reasons.
This is a pittance in terms of India's development needs and foreign investment in general in big mega projects, infrastructure, this or that, or digital India, or
But
whatever.
one of
all
the,
all the campaigns that
issues,
Modi
apart
has
from
launched.
this, of
But
course, apart
to talk
from
about
yes.
some philanthropic little money coming in there and making it such a big issue in bilateral relations, I think it is besides the point. And this
But
is an
keeping
agenda.
that aside,
This is an agenda
keeping that
is
aside,
being
Mr.
pushed.
Sibal and Arun, keeping that aside, those kind of hurdles, which are of course these perceptions that you have, and trying to work things out in a governmental structure, those hurdles are of course there. But is there also a lack, from the Indian side to tap the NRI talent, tap the investment? Do you see that there is a lack on that front?
See, our intent is there, but as you said, unless you have bilateral investment treaties with those countries where these NRIs reside, it will be difficult for us to actually materialize investments as smoothly as we would like. I would like to mention a couple of other things. Everything is not rosy about the diaspora and its potential to project India's image abroad. I mean, this is not a very pleasant thing to say, but if you are flying to India from the US via Europe, you will find that the first leg of the trip, the bathrooms in the toilets in the aeroplane, they are clean, they are fine, but in the second leg, you will find that it's messed up. So this, and the second leg would have a proportionately much larger contingent of Indians than in the first leg. So there are certain ways in which the way Indians conduct themselves doesn't really lend themselves to being seen as very good people. And the other thing that
you're contradicting yourself by saying that, because earlier in your previous answer you said that the conduct of Indians they're seen as a society.
In certain aspects, yes, but in certain other aspects, not so much.
Okay.
And the other thing, certain values in India which we are trying to overcome, are being replicated abroad. Say Pakistanis do honor killing in the UK. Indians do similar things. They mistreat maids in the US. That creates bad publicity, not only for them personally, but for the country as a whole. Underage marriage, these kind of certain things, gender-specific inequalities, and caste distinctions. As Mr. Acharya said, things move faster in India than in the diaspora community, which, in the hope of holding on to tradition and their home country values, tend to be more conservative in their social attitudes.
And
that will not reflect on India well.
Sriram, yes.
Tracy, I think one positive thing that's also happened, which I forgot to mention, is federalism, our federal structure, our states are increasingly being encouraged to go out and connect with our diaspora. One of the things the Prime Minister has done is he has brought in a lot of chief ministers, and in some cases the Pravasi Bharati Divas have actually showcased multiple chief ministers making a direct pitch to our OCIs and NRIs. And Gujarat was one of the first states when he was chief minister to set up an investment window in important centers of capital around the world. And now other states are also replicating it. I think that's another way by which this disconnect that Neil's mentioning between information about projects and issues that are happening on the grassroots and how NRIs could contribute could be bridged, because the states are on the ground. The central government can only do so much.
Yes.
And earlier the central government would sometimes block the states from doing their own commercial diplomacy overseas. But to an extent, this cooperative federalism or competitive federalism has now emerged, and that's another way in which I think we are now going to be able to reach out far better and send out the message that India is happening, as the Prime Minister says, come and give back to us. And I think that's going to get across far better now.
All right.
One has to be a little clear-sighted about this. What do we need in India to have this 8% growth or whatever else? We need huge investments in infrastructure, roads, highways, railways, this and that. Defense, manufacturing sector in general, smart cities, all these things. There are
just to interrupt you, do the remittances actually help in the GDP? Do they actually contribute to a certain extent?
It does.
Okay.
But the point is, I don't see any big diasporic players who can actually invest massively in these sectors which India needs. So therefore, we should look at this more realistically.
Okay.
That is one. The other is that better education of the diaspora in terms of development possibilities and this and that. This is a more general issue. We have to do more on the ground to familiarize India with what is happening in India. With the ease of doing business, this message will get spread.
Yes.
The more it gets spread, the more people become aware. that actually is becoming easier to invest in India. So I don't think that that a targeted effort at the Indian diaspora will yield better results than a much larger effort which covers everybody who wants to invest in India. And thirdly, this bilateral investment treaty. We don't have one with the United States. The United States is the biggest investor in our country. At the moment, we don't have functioning bilateral investment treaties, but investment is going on. Investment is going on. There is a big issue with regard to the manner in which we negotiated the earlier treaties and certain elements that now the West wants to include in these treaties where corporations can actually sue foreign governments. It's become a big issue. So it'll take a long time before we can have a meeting of minds. In the meantime, let me assure you, there'll be no let-up in investment in India because everybody knows this is a growing market, there are huge opportunities and they'll come in.
I just want to add one thing.
I'm running short of time, just 30
class
seconds.
Distinctions among the diaspora used to also reflect in our variegated attention to them. Earlier we used to only look up to the ones with the money and the professional education, be less concerned about those at the bottom, especially in the Gulf. I think that also is being bridged now, and so we are in a better position to have a holistic diaspora policy so that it becomes a force multiplier for our diplomats.
Absolutely, you summed it there. Absolutely, Sriram. I'll have to leave it here for the moment. Thank you to the three of you, and also Nish for joining me, of course, here on India's World. Like we've pretty much established that the nature of engagement with diaspora has changed according to the needs of time. So let's see, of course, how this develops further in the years to come. Send in your feedback. We look forward to that on indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. That's it for the moment. Thank you.